Hey, what's going on, guys? Kalamazi here, and with there being a pretty small alpha build this week on Shadowlands Alpha, I wanted to take some time to talk to you guys about two topics, I guess you could say, maybe issues, more so topics, that I think are important to discuss this early on into Shadowlands Alpha. Now, the first topic is one that I haven't really heard mentioned very much yet, which is actually surprising to me, but I do think it's pretty important to talk about early on, especially being this early into Alpha. The second one we've talked about a little bit on stream, but I do think it's also important to talk about here and just discuss certain things that could actually play more into that than certain people might think. Quick shameless plug here. I do stream 5 to 6 days a week on Twitch. All my Week ORS profiles add-ons are there available to you for free. If you want them, feel free to swing by, grab them, drop a follow while you're there. And if you want to hang out and discuss any of these topics or watch any Shadowlands Alpha play, feel free to do so. Now, as mentioned, I haven't really heard a whole lot about the first topic we're going to get into in a minute here. So if you guys feel so inclined, be sure to leave your own feedback and thoughts in the comment section below. Let's get right into this and talk about why I feel these both need to be discussed pretty early on here. Now, my first area of concern, and one that I've not heard much about so far, is one based around raid utility and comp/size in Shadowlands. Here's a list of some abilities that each class brings to a raid setting off the top of my head. Monks have their 5% physical buff, Demon Hunters have 5% magic, Mages have intellect, Warriors shout, Priest fortitude, Shamans have Wind Fury totem, Manatide totem, and there is a new Vesper totem of sorts in Shadowlands. Warlocks have Curse of Recklessness and Weakness, Paladins have Season of Autumn, which is a Covenant-based ability, or Diva Aura, which is, I believe, class-wide now, and Death Knights have Anti-Magic Zone returning. Now, I'm sure that I missed a few here and there, and tried to mention all the ones that aren't too situational, like Roars from Druids, but if you look at these abilities, that accounts for roughly 10 raid spots, which is actually half of a Mythic roster. If you want to run the Curse of Recklessness/Weakness combo for Warlocks, that means you'll need at least 2 in the raid, as well as Shamans bringing different totems based off their specs. Now, yes, technically you can use scrolls to replace some of these buffs, but keep in mind that the scrolls are being nerfed in power level come Shadowlands, and they were already weaker than the baseline class buff as is in BFA. Now, I get that Blizzard is looking to bring back certain iconic abilities from WoW's past in Shadowlands, and I'm actually really excited for just that, but I think it's important to keep in mind that raid sizes were also different in ages past. We had 40-man raids in Vanilla, and 25-man raids in BC with less classes available, but currently Mythic is locked at a size of 20 in BFA and, I would imagine, Shadowlands. Having roughly half your raid, which is most likely over 10, I probably just forgot a few things, set in stone comp-wise per se, before even reaching a boss, seems like it could easily make raiding on classes without that utility, like Rogues, Druids, and Hunters, pretty disappointing if they aren't tuned properly. Bringing a subpar damage profile as well as a class that doesn't have any raid utility in a Utility Matters expansion could be an issue, and if we see a fight like Gahun again, which required 4 Warlock gates, the final few raid spots are going to be extremely limited. Yes, it is early into Alpha, and yes, a whole lot can and most likely will still change, but with all this raid-wide utility returning, available raid spots are shrinking fast. With there still being some tuning made to classes and Covenant abilities, I'm curious to see if there will be any more raid-wide abilities added or even removed in an effort to counteract what we just spoke about, as I have not really heard this discussed much anywhere, but I think it really needs to be, as the 20-man roster does not give a whole lot of wiggle room. Now, the other area of concern that I have, and I know this has been a hot topic ever since Covenants were shown at BlizzCon, but I do think it's important to dive into while we're still in the early stages of Alpha. In a recent interview, Ian Hazzikostas mentioned that Covenants are gameplay focused, each with 3 unique soulbinds and Covenant-based abilities, as well as legendaries specific to said Covenant. Now, we've also known since BlizzCon that we will indeed have the option of swapping Covenants, but at a large cost. While we still don't know what exactly that cost will be, we were also told that leaving a Covenant is not hard, but realigning with the one you previously left is going to be the hard part. He also went on to mention that Covenants are a large part of Shadowlands and will have a large effect on PvE, but he feels that Blizzard can balance each Covenant overall. He does admit that differences exist, but bring to question how relevant they're going to be if it's a small difference like 1%. Now, personally, I do feel that Blizzard most likely has the tools to balance class-based Covenant spells to the best of their ability, but my main concern is that by taking a look at the current choices Warlocks have here, it's just not going to be possible. Some of these abilities are pretty much pure single target ones, while some bring with them a great deal of AoE damage and utility. An ability like Decimating Bolt that deals damage to only one target on cast, while also buffing the damage of our next 3 single target abilities, is going to certainly beat out an ability like Impending Catastrophe on patchwork single target bosses, barring the tuning of these abilities being, well, a catastrophe. When you look at it from a Mythic Plus burst damage perspective, however, I'm going to lean towards the ability that gives me a large amount of AoE burst damage and utility with applying curses, versus an ability that is only useful on single target fights. Now, these are both 2 different parts of the game, but the thing is that players like choices, and most players partake in both Rating and Mythic Plus. Not having the ability to swap between an AoE-based Covenant and then swap to your superior Rating Covenant ability for progression rating that night is pretty restrictive, and it's going to cause a lot of issues, and that's not even getting into Covenant-based Soulbinds or Legendaries. Now, I don't personally rate in Limit or Method, however, I do enjoy both Mythic Plus and Rating alike. If my best trait for each is from a different Covenant, this makes me feel obligated to play multiple characters of the same class, or I'm not bringing as much to my team as possible if I really enjoy playing Warlocks, or Death Knights, or Demon Hunters, for example. This is also counterintuitive when it comes to PvE and gearing, as normally Mythic Plus is used to supplement rating gear-wise, or vice versa, depending on what you're most interested in. As mentioned, we don't truly know just how restrictive the swapping of Covenants will be, but when it comes to the higher end rating scene that is, this is going to, I feel, probably force players into maintaining multiple characters of the same class. I understand that this is a very, very small portion of the player base, and will most likely end up not meaning a whole lot to the vast majority of it. Most players will end up choosing their Covenant based off looks and other things, but with WoW growing in popularity both due to the Race to World First coverage as well as the MDI, there's going to be some issues here, I feel. Even outside of high-end rating, with the way that Mythic Plus and the Mythic Plus meta has grown and evolved since Legion, mainly speaking on meta comping and such, this is also going to pose a few problems, I feel. Bringing a single target based ability that I'm using more so in rating into Mythic Plus, or even just a subpar ability at that, is not going to go over well. Certain generic abilities like the Venthyr Door of Shadows Teleport, which has a 35-yard range, are also going to mean a lot in dungeons, I'm sure, based off of certain routes and skips we've seen in BFA. There's also the topic of Soulbinds and Covenant-specific legendaries playing a role in what Covenants best suit your interests as well. While there is a chance that this further exacerbates the issue that I mentioned, I think there's also a chance here to use both systems, Soulbinds and Legendaries, as a way to fine-tune each Covenant a bit more than what it might initially seem. We know from the recent Zoltan interview that when we first join a Covenant, we will have access to 2 Soulbinds and receive a 3rd whenever the questline is complete. It was also mentioned that you're able to swap between them at any time, and they can currently be used anywhere. I think this system could potentially be used to actually tune Covenants across multiple AoE or single target settings. Doing so would most likely be pretty involved due to different nodes and such that each Soulbind has, but I am certainly willing to see if it can be done, and Blizzard does seem determined to get the tuning down as best as possible. They did also say that if, in the end, tuning Covenants becomes too much of an issue, they will allow swapping between them freely, but want to try and avoid that initially if possible. Even when it comes to legendaries right now, we don't really know much about them at this point in alpha, outside the fact that you can acquire the reagents from Torghast, which then can be used to attach legendary effects to legendary gear that's crafted by tailors, leatherworkers, blacksmiths, and jewel crafters alike. It was mentioned, however, that different Covenants will have different legendary effects, which does raise a few questions. I'm a bit concerned, for example, about a world where we have a best-in-slot legendary rating ability locked behind a Covenant that provides very little to rating as a whole. Then again, the more I think about it, I'm not sure if we even know if we are required to stay with that Covenant once we acquire that legendary ability. For example, if there's a best-in-slot rating ability locked behind the Bastion Covenant and I acquire that ability, if I go back to the Revendreth Venthyr Covenant, does that Bastion legendary ability stay relevant? Can I still wear that actual piece of gear that has the legendary effect on it? I suppose with the way they're approaching Covenants and not really wanting you to swap between them, chances are pretty high that they probably are locked behind said Covenant, and if you swap from one to another, you probably lose the legendary effect. Either way, it's certainly going to make for some interesting choices in the very first raid tier, depending on how tuning and everything swapping between Covenants actually goes. Either way, I've really enjoyed just about every part of Shadowlands Alpha so far. The new zones are amazing, as well as the new dungeons we've been able to test. Torghast has been an absolute blast, and I'm excited to dive into it even further down the line when more changes come. Be sure to drop your thoughts on both the Covenant abilities as well as the raid comp issue and legendaries I mentioned in the comment section below, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave them there as well. I'll be sure to get back to you. If you want to see more WoW content and help support the channel, be sure to smash those like, share, and subscribe buttons. Thanks guys, and I'll see y'all on stream. Peace.